Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge, and welcome to Keeping Relevant. If I were a lawyer, I'd want to be just like my guest, Steve Zeidman, an unabashed believer in social justice. He's a professor at CUNY Law School and the director of the Defenders Clinic, as well as the founder and co-director of the Second Look project, Beyond Guilt. So welcome, Steve.
Glad to be here, Ronnie.
Thank you. So where did you grow up?
New York City,
Yeah.
high school, Long Island.
Uh-huh.
So my family roots are in just about every borough except Staten Island.
Oh, all right, that explains it.
Yes, yeah, we'll leave it there.
So when you went to high school, I mean, what got you interested in this aspect of the law, criminal justice?
You know, going to law school in the first place, it's even hard for me to remember exactly what the motivation was.
Really?
I can't figure out exactly, I can't go back in time and recreate that in my head. I can remember what I wanted to do, which was to do some degree of public defense. You know, there was an awareness back then when I was in law school of a criminal legal system that was just beginning to get mammoth. So this was in the 80s. And watching the prison population grow and grow and grow, and a couple of faculty members who were kind of pointing it out before most others were really aware of it. And so the challenge, I thought, to most of us in law school was, you know, what are you going to do about it? So that kind of pushed me way back then, interning with public defender offices during law school and starting as a public defender as soon as I graduated.
Yeah. What is it that's so compelling about the population that you have now concentrating on? What is it about that group of people? So
here's what I hope public defenders, so I'm talking to a very specific group of people right now. You're having been a public defender for a number of years, you're so focused on that individual in that moment, what they're facing, and especially the more senior you get, you're doing more serious cases. But the truth of the matter is when the case is over, if there's a guilty plea, if there's a conviction after trial, there's a sentencing and then you're on to the next case.
Right.
And there's sort of a, it's going to sound more pejorative than I mean it, but like a willful ignorance about what happens thereafter. And so there are appeals lawyers who work on the appeal, but even that. So let's say someone gets 25 to life, they're convicted, a couple of years later their appeal ends, and then they're on their own for 20 years. And once you go into the prisons and you meet all the lifers and long-termers, I think if you have any sense, any degree of humanity, you ask yourself, why are all these people in here for so long? You remember the first time you went inside a prison? Not the very, well, I'll tell you this. What I do remember is I hadn't been in a state prison for a number of years. And then it was about 10 years ago when I went in to take the first person that I was working with who was a lifer, someone doing 75 to life who you know, Judy Clark, and went into Bedford Hills. That was your first one? Judy was the first Clemency client. And talking with Judy and beginning to kind of get a better sense of how many people were doing these sentences where they were, you know, they were sentenced to perish in prison. Regardless how they changed, regardless what they did, regardless of anything, that sentence was written in stone. And as soon as you sort of confront that, and when I say confront that, you're looking at a person who's sentenced to die in prison and they have no option, it just makes you realize that there's just something fundamentally wrong. So from my perspective, it's how can I help individuals, but also on a kind of larger scale, how do we sort of correct this across the board? So from the 80s to now, New York is incarcerating fewer people. From the 80s. I mean, that was Rockefeller drug and the construction of prisons all over the place and filling them up, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a high of, I think, about 72,000 people in state prison, and now we're at about 32,000. Is the country still the highest rate of incarceration in the world? It is indeed. Is that amazing? It's not exactly something to be proud of. And what's interesting to me is that's been known for a while now, and you would think that would motivate some fundamental change. Yeah. Right? That's just not something you really want to advertise, or that's not a tag you want, but it lingers. And now we're putting people into prison. Oh gosh, yeah. It's such an incredible mess. So what we have, though, with this diminished population is more older people serving longer terms. Correct. Right? Well, there are two things that have happened. That once, and you mentioned the Rockefeller drug law reform, so once that happened, the vast majority of people who are serving these life sentences for drug cases, they've been resentenced. So only about 6 to 8% of the people, of those 32,000 in New York State Prison, are there for narcotics offenses. So when people hear about mass incarceration and we have to redress it, so many people say, yes, it's true, we have to remove people who are convicted of drug offense. We've done that in New York.
That's interesting.
So who's left are older people, and the majority of people in New York State Prison, and this is just something we all have to confront, they're there, they were convicted of very violent crimes. The question is, how much time must you serve if you were convicted of a violent crime?
And they're not equally distributed. I mean, the people of color are still more people that are convicted.
Correct.
Even if it's violent crimes,
Overwhelmingly
not
so.
drugs.
Yep. The state population is overwhelmingly people of color.
It is.
Yeah.
And the women have increased, though.
Women have increased as well.
That's interesting. Why have they increased? Who knows?
Who knows, really. And it's the same thing. It's mostly for violent crimes.
What percentage of these people are in a poverty level?
Overwhelming. Depending, there are, demographic studies about all sorts of things. High school diploma, country of origin, but the one common thread that runs through all of it is poverty. Yeah.
And lower educational level.
Everything that goes with it,
Right.
everything that's associated with it.
So it's obvious what we could need to do.
It seems so obvious. In fact, someone you probably might remember. You remember Alfonso David when he was Andrew Cuomo's counsel? When we started our clemency work in earnest, and we were filing a lot of clemency applications, and you find out in short order that your clients have similar backgrounds. And so the clemency application would start detailing our client's background. And I remember Alfonso saying this to me, and he wasn't being cold. He was trying to make a point. I really did appreciate it. He said to me, look, if you submit one more clemency application with the opening paragraph being about the trauma and abuse and the poverty your client grew up in, it's washing over us because they're reading the same thing over and over and over.
Again.
Which I get it, but at the same time, well, that's the reality of it.
Right.
But I guess what he was saying is there needs to be something.
Isn't that it?
Yeah, which
More.
is, it's depressing,
Yeah.
but I understood it.
Yeah. So the problem was these cases were heard in court. Some of them were plea bargained.
Some.
Some of them went to trial. Most of them went to trial.
Most of the people serving the most massive sentences went to trial, and they were convicted and hammered by judges. What it's, people call it the trial tax, the trial penalty. The really sounds hyperbolic, the kind of the immoral extra punishment that's imposed for someone who has the temerity to say, I actually want a trial.
Yeah. And why you worked for a couple of years, not as an attorney practicing, but with a court system?
Yes, yes.
And what did you learn there about what went on in the courts?
You know what I learned more than anything working that? It's trying to think of not necessarily the gentlest way. It's a massive bureaucracy. It's like any other bureaucracy. To the extent that people think our courts are about seeking justice, the courts are about efficiency. They're about how fast can we move so many cases through the system. It's another bureaucracy. Judges who are elected want to make sure they're reelected. Judges who are appointed want to make sure they're reappointed. So what's at the forefront of everyone's mind? The idea of doing the right thing in every individual case?
You mean we have these tests of self-respect and principle in all aspects of our life?
Yeah, everywhere.
Yeah.
And trying to get someone to do the right thing. And by the way, I always say this to my students. Don't be cavalier about it. Because if you wanted to be a judge and you were faced with a high-profile case, and you really thought the right thing to do was something that might go against public opinion. I mean, let's say it was a police officer who was hurt, killed. But you think on the facts of this case, the person who was charged is either innocent or maybe they deserve a lesser sentence. You have to understand you're going to get pilloried in the press. You are going, and especially now with social media, people are going to come after you. So I get it. That's why I say I'm not being cavalier. It does take a level of courage is too strong a word, but I do understand that why people are loath or afraid Having said that, then don't do the job.
Right.
Right? If you're afraid to do it, if you're worried about being reelected or you're worried about the New York Post, then get another
Don't
job.
do them. But do you think there's another way of doing it?
Oh gosh, here's years and years ago, when Judith Kaye was the chief judge in the state of New York, I was on a task force she put together. It was called the Future of Indigent Defense Services. And what struck me, and this was a challenge, can we be unencumbered by what we know about how the system works and just pretend we don't know anything? What would it look like? Because I don't think it would look like what we've got. And I've been at this for a long time and have yet to see any sort of fundamental change in the way the criminal legal system works. I can walk into a courtroom in Manhattan where I first practiced in the 80s, and the words, everything is the exact same, as if somehow we got it right, as opposed to, and by the way, maybe to some people we did get it right. We can mass process, thousands of people of color in a month. So maybe that is, for some people, the whole purpose. I don't know. Ultimately, it's just going to have to bubble up from the community, from advocacy groups, from the organized, from the people who are most impacted by the system to somehow demand change.
So let's talk about this new project. I mean, it's relatively new that you're doing, right?
Relatively new, yeah.
How many people have you helped get clemency or reducing the sentence or out?
We've helped bring home 84 people who were all serving life or long-term sentences. Most of them were serving sentences so long that they were, without a doubt, they were going to perish in prison. So the most recent person who came home, a wonderful guy named Percy West, was sentenced to 132 to life when he was 19 years old.
No. So what happened to him? How did he even get into this predicament?
The case involved police officers, and already that ratchets up the sentence. It happened in an era when really tough on crime, well, I guess that's been sort of the mantra forever, but it was really in full force. He turned down a plea. You turn down a plea, you're going to get extra punishment, and here it just went. It's indefensible.
So he went to jury trial, convicted, and the judge said,
132.
You're never going to be
Correct.
A citizen of the world with any interest in, the whole long spiel.
Yeah, you know what they say, Ryan? That's what I love what you just said, and I just want to take it in a different direction. I have now read, so we've represented about 200 people, and we always get the sentencing transcript. So I see, what did the judge say at the time they imposed a life sentence? And it's chilling to me, because it's beyond hubris. It's not only that they're saying, you know what, you're never going to walk free. They'll say things like, you will forever be a threat. You will forever be dangerous. And when you read it, especially now, I'm talking to someone 30 years later who's become a remarkable person, who works in the hospice unit in the prison, who has the support of the superintendent, of the chaplain. And I think the nerve of the judge, the idea that you could say to a 19-year-old, I know, based on, because I'm wearing a black robe, I know you will forever be dangerous, and therefore I'm going to give you a sentence that ensures you die in prison. I don't really have the right adjectives. I mean, it's horrific.
And so they can determine a sentence with a minimum or with no minimum. I mean, something to life.
Yeah, most of the people who we work with were convicted of violent crime, usually homicide. And so that you're going to get what they call an indefinite sentence. They'll say, here's the minimum, here's the maximum. Typical sentence, 25 to life, 50 to life.
So 25 to life means that after 25 years, you can appear before a parole board.
Correct. And by the way, if I can, this is something I have said to so many people. People will say when they hear, like, I'm going to go back to Judy Clark for a moment. Judy was sentenced to 75 to life. And when I would talk to people about it, they'd say, well, 75 to life, but what was she going to do? Come home in 20, 25? And I recognize there are some states where the numbers, they're elastic, I'll put it that way. So someone might get 20 years and it turns out they'll serve 10. New York, we are what's called a truth in sentencing state. Thanks to former Governor Pataki, we get federal money to be what's called a truth in sentencing state. So 75 to life, that means you are going to do 75 years before you see the parole board. 25 to life, doesn't matter what you do, you're going to do 25 years before you see the parole board. And to me, that's part of the problem. There's no review at any point in time.
Which is the crux of your new organization.
Exactly.
But just before we start to talk about it, going before the parole board is no treat either.
Correct. That's the other part of the problem.
Parole board hearings are outrageous. They're done with a camera. You're in a room by yourself,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And the first question is, what was your crime?
The first question, the middle question, and usually the last question. And so someone doing 25 to life, one of the first persons we ever worked with who was he was sentenced to 25 to life. He'd been in 44 years. They kept denying him parole, denying him parole, denying him parole, and they kept saying, we think you're not sufficiently taking full responsibility for what you
You
did.
don't show enough remorse.
Exactly. And I have
The
to say,
phrases are right there,
yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly. Or you will say, look, I regret what happened, I'm really sorry, and the board, in its infinite wisdom, will say, well, we don't think your expressions of remorse are genuine. I mean, it's a sham, it really is. So people can get that 25 to life and do 30, 35, 40, or more. It's another system that needs to be broken down and rethought.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. All right, now tell me about your organ.
What we're doing now?
Yes.
Yeah, well, we, back in about 2015, when we first, this is when I keep referencing Judy, and I should, because she's many ways for me the fulcrum of all this work. Meeting Judy Clark, who was doing 75 to life, going into the prison, and it shows you how starved people inside are for some help. I wrote an op-ed in, of all places, the New York Law Journal, which you wouldn't think gets a lot of readership,
Right.
okay? But it was about redemption and mercy and the need for greater use of clemency and a reevaluation of sentencing. That led to letters pouring in from people in New York State Prison. I read this piece, I got 50 to life when I was 17. I read your piece, I got life without, I read your, can you help, can you help, can you help? And we began to, really it was like a toe in the water, but as the students got involved as well and we began to work in different prisons, then more word spread, and then more letters, and they've never stopped. Ronnie, the letters have never stopped. We got over 1,000 requests for help last year. This is in New York State alone. And at most, the way we are presently constituted, 15, 20 people, that's all we have the capacity to help in any given year.
I keep going back and forth in time and in life. We are very vindictive people.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And people look upon prison as that's where you belong.
Yeah.
How many people have ever been in a prison?
True.
What do you think about the days that people, what do we do about that? We can't.
Ronnie, I think you put your finger on what's the ultimate problem. I say to my students every year, going back to what you said before, and most of them by now, law students, they're familiar with this, said, okay, the United States is the world's jailer. 5% of the world's population, 23% of the world's incarcerated. They seem to know that, and I'll say, why do you think that's so? And they come up with, and I ask this question just at the start of the semester every year, and they'll say, it's the war on drugs, it's the tough on crime, it's racism, it's capital. They'll say all of these things, which no doubt are true. The one thing I think they always neglect, in my view, is this is the most punitive country. It's just, it's so deeply ingrained. This idea of punishment being like, you did X, you deserve to be.
It's like the witch's mental of it.
Judgmental. Feels like it.
Yeah.
It really does, especially when you compare the United States to other countries. And this is the irony to me, a country that, like, a lot of people like to, pretend to be faith-based, but the idea that there's no room for redemption.
Right.
We're going to give you 50 years because you deserve to be punished. And by the way, we're not going to revisit it. So you want to come back to us after 30 years and say, hey, would you look at me now? No. Which is why, and we put this in every clemency application, every chance I get to speak about this. If we are ever looking for support for this idea of reevaluating sentences, the easiest place to go is the faith-based community. Because reverends, ministers, priests, you could go on and on. Who else believes and supports efforts at recognizing and valuing redemption? It's the faith-based community.
How many clients do you have right now?
Right now, well, that's the other, it's a hard thing to say because we've worked with about 200 people and 84 are home, but those other 100 and whatever that is, 16, they're still our clients. So we've submitted some clemency applications 8, 9 years ago that we just continually supplement.
And is Governor Hochul doing enough clemencies? And what's happened to that
Yeah.
plan that we were hopeful for, that there would be a continuing
Exactly.
granting of clemency appeal?
Early on, she did some very important things. So prior to her, when it was Governor Cuomo, it was hard to get anybody's attention in the governor's office to look at clemency because there was no really dedicated clemency unit. So there were people who had a lot of things. They would say, well, it's sort of in my portfolio, but I'm also working on energy, education, other things. So Governor Hochul said, you know what, we're going to have a dedicated clemency unit. We have a director, a deputy director, a staff, which is tremendous. And then she did. She made 2 public statements where she said, okay, I'm persuaded clemency is not going to be a once-a-year thing on Christmas Eve. I'm going to do this on an ongoing basis. And in 2023, she did. Never enough, but there were clemency grants several times, I think it was 3 or 4, during the year. Last year, I do not know what happened. Only 3 people had their sentences commuted last year. 2 occasions, in May, the Friday before Memorial Day, and then right around Christmas Eve.
And then the closer you get to elections,
That's the worry.
the harder it also becomes.
Exactly, exactly.
It's the difference between clemency and pardon
Yeah.
is a pardon, usually the person is already out, right? And the record
Almost
is
always.
expunged.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting kind of, it's counterintuitive because when you say all right, clemency is an umbrella term. We're talking about a pardon or a sentence commutation. And I will say to people, look, a pardon erases your conviction. It's expunged as if it never happened. A commutation, you will have that conviction on your record, but your sentence is reduced. And when I say to people, which do you think is more controversial? Everybody says a pardon, because it's erasing your conviction. And I say, well, no,
It's not.
it's not.
Interesting.
It's because the commutations are for people in prison,
Yeah.
and the pardons are usually for people
Right.
who are out. So
Right.
both Governor Cuomo and Governor Hochul have granted hundreds more pardons
Right.
than sentence
Easy.
commutations.
Right.
Much easier. There's no blowback.
Right. So now, your program is, the legislation you're supporting is mandates 10 years in prison and then a rehearing
Correct.
with the judge.
Yep. Yeah, this is a Second Look Act. It's happening across the country. There's efforts going on in Maryland for a Second Look bill. There's efforts going on in Connecticut for a Second Look bill, efforts going on in Vermont. And we have a Second Look bill here in New York, a wonderful bill. Really, you know, you can reduce it to its essence. And this, I'm going to try and avoid getting in the legal weeds about this. But when you're arrested, this is my stump speech, okay? When I speak to the elected officials, I say, look, in New York, when you're arrested, doesn't matter what you're charged with, your lawyer can file a motion to dismiss the charges in the interest of justice. That's the phrase, meaning it's the right thing to do for a variety of reasons. Throw this out, okay. If you're convicted and you get a sentence on that first appeal, you can say to the appellate court, this is usually a year or 2 after you've been convicted, would you reduce my sentence in the interest of justice? And they can. But 10, 20, 30 years later, we do have a statute for resentencing. You can apply for resentencing, but only if your sentence is unlawful. In other words, there's no interest of justice provision. The Second Look bill, the Second Look Act, in my view, it just adds that. It just says somebody can file a motion in court for resentencing in the interest of justice, and then a judge can decide whether to grant it or not. It's that simple.
So it will not only allow people who have earned really their relief, it will serve as a magnet for other people to follow that person's footsteps.
Exactly.
And it'll reduce the population and the cost of imprisonment.
All of the above.
Incarceration.
Well, everybody who gets clemency tells me the same story, because usually, there's some time before they come out. There are different kind of sentence commutations, but I remember a guy named Alfonso Riley, wonderful person now, who is now the head of paralegal services at Legal Aid, which is just remarkable what Alfonso has done. But what he told me is when he got clemency, there was about 3 weeks before he ultimately was released. He said in that 3 weeks, it was amazing. So many people inside came up to him and said, wait, what did you do? Oh, you went to college, you did this, you did that. He said guys who hadn't left their cells in years were suddenly motivated. Guys who spent all their time in the yard said, you know what, okay, it instilled hope. And it motivates that young kid coming in.
Definitely.
You're a 19-year-old getting 50 to life, you think, I'm done. I might not live that long. But if you know that there's a possibility, if clemency, if there was a second look bill, if you were reevaluated, of course it would motivate. Say, hey, wait a minute, you might not do 50 years. You're going to get reevaluated in 10 years. Get yourself together, do what you need to do, and maybe you'll come home. And by the other thing I want to add about that is the people who also support it are correction officials. Mm-hmm. Say it makes for a much safer,
right,
calmer environment inside.
It's like sending everybody to college, to high school and college,
sure. Mm-hmm.
and graduate school.
Yep.
And do you think if more people went inside a prison, they might understand it a little better?
I do. I think there's this notion of distance and or proximity. Mm-hmm. The more people go in.
Really get the feeling.
Yeah, and I appreciate there's always this idea that we're going to take judges into the prison and it's a public relations visit. I'm talking about really going in and
right,
sitting and talking with people.
Right.
Talking, spending a day, ideally more than a day.
Yeah.
And then you become, you recognize what's going on in a whole different way.
We're at the end of the program. We haven't even talked about the impact of putting somebody in prison.
The destruction of the
families and the community and everything.
Yeah.
So I hope we're going to find another occasion to do this.
Me too.
All right. And please keep on doing it. It's so remarkable.
Oh, thanks, Ronnie. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. CUNY TV now has an app. Downloading the app will let you watch any show, including mine, at your convenience.